discussion on anti-Blackness. My name is Lena Gardner. I am the Executive Director of Black Lives Unitarian Universalism Organism Collective. Interview form, that's a mouthful. And I'm joined today by Dr. Takiyah Amin, Dr. Michael Dumas, and Penny Wiley, who's also part of the lead team on the collective. How this is going to work today is that we are actually just going to have a fishbowl conversation between our professors, but we are not going to stay on for the next 90 minutes. Just know we know that, and I'm sorry. So how this will work is a fishbowl conversation. Then we are going to actually break folks out into identity affinity groups, and we've created some questions for y'all to answer in your groups after you hear some of the content, and we'll ask you to answer those questions. And we do have large papers somewhere. I saw it being brought up. Awesome. And then we'll reconvene as a large group and do some very quick reading and reporting out of core questions. And then Penny will just close us out. And I'll just name that for the Black folks in the room, after this session, we will be going to the healing space, the exclusively Black healing space. And we just want to name that this topic is more difficult to hear, to talk about, to experience as a Black person living in a Black body. And so we are creating that space for Black folks, knowing that when we did this last year, it created, it can create some pain. And so we want to make space for that and be in community with people. So all the folks who are identified as Black are welcome to that space directly after this session. Oh, great, yes. And this is a discussion happening tomorrow, and actually Kenny's going to talk about that at the end, as I look at my outline. It's all planned out. So with that, I think I'm just going to open it up and ask y'all a really easy, simple question. What is anti-Blackness?
Okay. It's great to be here. One of the things I wanted to start with is, as I was in the last session and I was looking around this room and I said, something else happened in this space. It'll be a lot. I'll be loud.
Who are you? Sit on the table.
Excuse me. We will not be sitting on the table. We will not be standing up for the whole 90 minutes of this workshop.
One at a time.
We will be sitting down. This is Dr. Michael Dumas, who I've already introduced. This is Dr. Takiyah Amin, who I've already introduced. All right?
So one of the things that I was thinking, I said something's familiar about this convention center, and I remember that this was one of the places during Katrina that people had to come, and I just Googled a newspaper article, and they were talking about people died here in this space. And I don't know if that's been mentioned yet, or what it means to even be in this space where people died, and most of those people would have been Black, because most people displaced by Katrina were Black. So part of what it means to think about anti-Blackness, and again, this is part of, there's a scholarly tradition, I don't want to, we will be kind of leaning to some of the theoretical stuff, but we're going to apply it. We're going to do that. But it is important to think theoretically and to think about what we can kind of glean from that without getting trapped in the theories. So you don't have to be a heavy theory head or an academic to get this. But that's why I wanted to begin with this idea that people actually died in this space, and they died because they were Black. They didn't die because they were diverse or multicultural, or because of the long, what we call the afterlife of slavery. Didn't matter, and in fact that they didn't have lives at all, right? So the central piece of anti-Blackness is, oh, there we go, this really does require me to do this. So the central piece of anti-Blackness is understanding the specificity of Blackness within a larger conversation around race and multiculturalism, diversity, difference. What is the specificity of Black experience? And the specificity is that Black people were property. That we came as property, not as second-class citizens, not as lesser humans, but as non-humans, as things. And this gets to what Lena was already saying, how difficult this is. Whenever I teach about this in class, it's really difficult for Black folks because what does it mean to imagine that you have been imagined and constructed and treated as property, as a thing to be? When people had, when they would bequeath their goods to their, white people would bequeath their goods to other folks, they would have a whole will, right? They would say, oh, to my daughter I leave these spoons, silver spoons, and this cow, and this Negro wench, and it would be right along that list. That's why it's so important to think that's the specificity. No other group, there's not an analogy to this. Understand this as property. We'll get more into that, but that's key.
One thing that I would lift up along those lines is, to Dr. Dumas' point, is it's anti-Blackness at its core centers the thingification of Black life and Black people. The idea of Black people as non-human and therefore without bodily autonomy and therefore without history and therefore without rights that anybody else has to respect, right? And so if I think about that in terms of my first experience with Unitarian Universalism, I was 14 years old, went to a UU church, heard the words of Reverend Joel Miller, who I haven't had a chance to reconnect with until this General Assembly, which was such a blessing and a gift. Had a wonderful time until I went into the basement and was descended upon by white women at that congregation who started to touch my skin and my hair and sort of descended all over my physical body. And it was confusing, it was scary, it made me angry, and it harkened back to what I've seen historically in terms of sort of auction block practices where you would look at Black women's teeth and inspect their hair and all sorts of things like that. It's about this thingification of Black people whereby our humanity isn't a consideration at all. Not that it is marginalized or ignored, but that it is without consideration. Yeah.
So one of the questions I was hoping that y'all could go into, or one of the concepts, is in preparation for leading a workshop similar to this last year, I was really struck by the idea of dispossession and of Black death and Black pain as a sort of currency within an American context. And I'm wondering if you can explore those topics a little bit more. And also to break this down for people on the difference that we're not talking about white supremacy here, we're not talking about just racism, that like all these words aren't actually synonymous. And if you can tease that out a little bit more.
Wow, there's a lot of terms here. So let's start just by thinking about, where to start with that? Well, I want to start this way, and it gets to this notion of death, and it is that much of the conversation around anti-Blackness, or kind of thinking about it, is really trying to make sense of Black suffering. And so what Takiyah experienced at 14 was one piece of Black suffering. It wasn't just discrimination or a bias, but it actually is a continuation of a long trajectory of Black suffering. And the thing about Black suffering is that part of why Black suffering exists is because it actually is seen as what Black people are supposed to do, is to suffer, right? And to endure pain. And actually there's research that suggests that people don't believe that doctors don't believe that Black people experience as much pain. Police officers also don't believe that the body can experience that much pain. That's part of the afterlife of slavery. Part of slavery was, in the sense, that you could work Black people like chattel all day, all night, as long as you could. They don't eat very much food, so you don't give them very much. I mean, I was in Puerto Rico, when they brought Black people over to build those forts that all the tourists kind of tour, they said they gave them less food. They said, well, they can endure on just this little bit. And so there's this sense of really centering this sense of what does it mean as a people to experience this in the flesh, on the flesh. And so this notion of death, as morbid as that's right, but it's at the center of this, the sense that all Black people are really entitled to do is to be accumulated, you've dispossessed of one's body, so that one's death is not even one's own, it's not up to oneself, but it actually is the entitlement of non-Black people to kill Black people if they want to, if it satisfies their desires. So if Black people are not brought just as workers, which is often the way some history textbooks have been misinterpreting this, right? If you're in education, it's like, well, you know, there are forced serfs. No, it was your Blackness that made you, not the fact that you were like slaves like other people might be for indentured servitude. No, the Blackness from birth. You were natally, this is a theoretical term, you were natally determined to be slaves by the color of your skin. So Black became synonymous with slavery, which means that you did not have your own body. Your body belonged to someone else. So then you were entitled to touch their hair. These are the more current manifestations of this, right? You're entitled to be poked and prodded, to be shot to death, because that body did not belong to you.
Yeah. Some of you know that my area of research, my PhD is actually in dance studies. My area is 20th century American performance. So I think a lot about the body, and I think a lot about embodiment. And one of the things that I think resonates in this conversation is that when we're talking about anti-Blackness, we have to understand that there's a pervasive idea in this afterlife of slavery which suggests Black bodies are only valuable to the extent that they're meeting someone else's needs. That the purpose of Black bodies, in essence, is to serve the needs, desires, or will of other folks. And we see the legacy historically and contemporarily that whenever Black people endeavor to use their body, whether that is their voice, their intellect, their talents, for their own means, whether that is their own pleasure, their own artistic expression, their own entrepreneurial vision, that's often confronted with violence. It's often confronted with violence, both physical and rhetorical, right? I didn't intend to lift this up here, but it feels appropriate. We've dealt with that in blue. The assumption that we would even have the nerve to speak up and speak out as Black Unitarian Universalists, it's like, well, who do those people think they are to do that? Who gave them permission? What right do they have? And it's like, well, we have our own voice and life and experience, but that's illegible if we're talking about Blackness, right? And we've experienced threats coming into this GA. I know you don't want to believe that. No one would do that. We're UUs. We're also predominantly white. And what we see historically is that when white folks feel confronted, and often that confrontation sits at the location of Black self-determination, the response is always violent, whether it's physical or rhetorical violence. And that's something that we had to consider even when we were planning to come here to New Orleans, even in our great liberal faith. So you all know where anti-Blackness lives. It's not just out there, it's right in here.
So this brings up also a question for me. I think being situated in a lot of different movement spaces, especially also in solidarity with other non-Black people of color and Indigenous communities, can you speak to, I've heard it said before, like, oh, well, why is Blue so focused on Black and whites? And I'm wondering if you speak to this sort of continuum of anti-Blackness and white as constructed as fully human, and Blackness constructed as fully inhuman, as possession, as property, and how in an American context, all people of different shades are placed within this spectrum and within this relationship to anti-Blackness. And then the second part of that too is to think about how does this operationalize within Black communities, within non-Black POC communities, and how, you know, just speak a little to that and how we can, maybe how we can learn to recognize it, stuff like that.
Yes.
I think, you know, I'm going to go back to some of the conversations I'm having with Eve Tuck, who's a colleague of mine in education, who's one of the kind of leading emerging Indigenous scholars. And so we've been having conversations around the relationship between settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, or kind of this afterlife of slavery, and where those groups get positioned and how they're each different than some broad category of people of color in a broad sense, right? those who primarily have been immigrants who have come of their own. So you've got, the reason why, on the one hand, I've named that indigenous folks aren't part of the conversation is because indigenous folks are imagined as in the past, as gone, as already dead, right? So there's no sense of their right to be there. So they've been dispossessed of land, and therefore they don't exist in that at all. So there's a way that so that's important to understand. Black folks sort of came as property, so they also weren't citizens or kind of present in their own bodies either. And so there's a way that the genocide of indigenous folks, the use of black bodies for not just work, but also just for pleasure. Pleasure, dance for me, do whatever for me, whatever it is. Your body available as a sexual to these things. So those groups kind of stand apart in terms of needing to look at the specificity of indigenous life and the specificity of black life. And then there's this kind of in the indigenous folks talk about indigenous theory stuff, talks about this the settler and how white folks kind of definitely position themselves as most entitled to settlement, but then they invited other groups to join them in also settling the nation. That wasn't offered to either indigenous folks or black folks. And so it's a tough thing to kind of imagine other folks of color who are also subject to racism and white supremacy, but also then being invited to be settlers in a way that neither black nor indigenous folks has ever been invited. So all this says is that we really need to think about this in its specificity, and not just kind of this general, racism in some broad sense, but really understand what that's about. The other thing is that I would say this, in my field in education, obviously, the big thing is around diversity and multiculturalism and environments for all children. And so what's happened is that people say, well, we need to get away from the black-white binary, right? You've probably heard that before. Why is everything have to be black and white? But moving away from the black-white binary is mostly just moving away from blackness. It's never really like, when you start talking about white people. No, it's always, and so you get the phrase, enough about the blacks, which already, I have this thing about people who say blacks instead of black people or black folks. This is my own thing, but you guys can get the blacks. I mean, it's often like kind of uttered in that way. But so often you'll hear, we need to, enough about the blacks. It's time to move on, right? So in other words, it's time to move on. In other words, enough, we don't need to hear from you anymore. It's always been about you. And on some level, I believe that there is a black-white binary in the sense that white people created it. And as Lena mentioned it, the sense of, on the one side is the human best exemplified by whiteness. And that's how whiteness even knew what it was. Because remember, it's not enough to say whiteness is a social construction. I want you to kind of think about whiteness as a violent fiction. So because it only existed, whiteness only existed to kill, to dispossess. So there's a lot of work that talks about like, well, what might be available for people who are socially positioned as white after whiteness, right? So some of you may be familiar with some of that work, and I don't want to weigh in too much on it, but it is an interesting thing to think about for folks who are positioned as white. What if you understand that it's a violent fiction that was created to kill, well, what other possibilities might there be for being? And the things that what was in opposition to whiteness then was blackness, was the absence of the human. And so in some ways, although we don't want to silence the experiences of our Asian American folks, Pacific Islanders, Latinos, Latinx folks, is we have to think about them as existing within a relation where there is this imagined black-white binary. And so often, of course, it's about how close you're positioned to whiteness and how far you can be positioned from blackness. And so, although it's not real, we don't want to reify the black-white binary in the sense that we only talk about black and white people and not talk about other folks. We have to understand that this is how whiteness even knew what it was to create itself as opposite from and above blackness.
Right. That makes me think of a few things that might be of use here. One is, as Unitarian Universalists, we're having this discussion about first principle, right? Inherent worth and dignity of every person.
Yes.
And that's a principle that as a UU, of course, I value and love, but I can't help but think about how the construction of who is a person never included me.
Wow.
So the shift from person to being is like, you can't even respect my humanity, but we got to respect the narwhals and the seals and it's an important consideration, right? It also makes me just think about how whiteness in that black-white binary is established as a kind of ideal, right? It is the thing you want to be. As someone who works with young people, I know you have experiences like this too with college students. I had a student tell me I was teaching my civil rights movement this year, long Black freedom struggle, and the student was telling me about how, the entire civil rights struggle, they were on school meetings, was really because Black people just really wanted to eat with white people. We just really wanted to sit next to them at lunch counters and eat cheeseburgers with them, ride with them on the bus. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I gotta walk out, count to 10, come back, because now I gotta teach. I gotta teach in this context, right? But it was shocking to these white students, really, to imagine that everybody doesn't want to be you, or look like you, or have your culture, or talk like you. That was like shocking, because whiteness has been established as an ideal. So if we think about that in relationship to non-Black people of color, and even in the context of the settler, for European immigrant groups who come to the United States, part of the success was to buy into whiteness. We don't talk about that very much. But, every young white person I was ever close to in school all had that story about granddaddy who came here with a nickel and some lint in his pocket and started a business and managed to do X, Y, Z. And I just don't understand why Black people aren't like that. I just don't understand why you aren't the same way. And after I, catch my breath, we have to have a conversation about how part of that thriving was your grandfather's access and ability to be white, and ability to aspire and take on markers of whiteness, whether that was no longer going to your Eastern Orthodox church, or cutting that last name in half because it had too many consonants in it, or stop cooking that funky food from the old country, whatever old country it was, and kind of mixing into this fictionalized white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ideal. What's less talked about is that part of buying into that ideal was also adopting anti-Blackness as fundamental. So part of the way you get to be white is by imbibing and practicing and teaching and passing on in overt, covert ways the idea that Black life, Black being is abject and has no value. Amen. So I do think there needs to be a conversation about what is there after whiteness, right? What is there other than whiteness in terms of ways of being? And I also think that's why people's work to do. Amen.
In my last professional conference, when I go to the American Educational Research Association, and so I was chairing a panel that, as the chair, you basically keep the time. They asked me to do it at the end, so I didn't know what was going to be on the panel. We have an esteemed colleague, and his research is about the dangers of Black exposure. And he didn't say danger, he did say the phrase Black exposure. And what it was is that he basically was arguing that Black students' exposure to other Black students was detrimental to their academic success. Oh. But there was nobody, did that in the room. A few people just gasped in the room, mostly from Black folks. But most people, it sounded really academic. And so he had statistics up that showed that, it was an argument for integration. And really the argument for integration is also kind of infected with a certain kind of anti-Blackness, which is Black students will do better if they can get away. If we just take a few of them off and put them in, they don't need to be around too many Black students. Of course, what really is I'm surprised he can do this as a statistician, is kind of control for issues of how anti-Blackness would affect you. So it's not the Black people that are actually the exposure to Black people that's actually detrimental, but the exposure to the anti-Blackness, but that's not part of his model at all. Right. So he and this is a new thing. It's not new, but they're really advancing this idea that Black exposure, let alone that exposure sounds like exposure to some kind of toxin or something like that. And they were very serious about this, and it was in a benevolent way. And so really trying to find ways to get Black people out of relation with other Black people for their own good.
I have to follow up quickly. Leading into this GA, I was one of the facilitators for Grow, Thrive, Shift this year, which is what the Multicultural Leadership School used to be. Some of you who are familiar with that. It was a wonderful opportunity to work with youth and young adults of color in our faith. But one of the things that did come up, and I'm not going to reveal anything, private or personal, but one of the things that did come up in our conversations with non-Black youth of color was their own painful experiences of basically being told that it was their job essentially to avoid getting too close to Black folks. Don't talk like them, don't be like them, they don't have a culture, don't be too close, and sort of recounting these stories of being children and having friends from all kinds of backgrounds, but being sort of warned by their parents, right? Not to be too mixed up with or connected to those people over there. And that particularly for young adults who have immigrant legacies, who were first generation born here, that they felt a burden to succeed. And that part of that success was not being with or like those other folks, those black folks. So yes, we need to think in ways that are complex and nuanced, but the black-white binary actually gives us use if we think about the fact that whiteness is positioned at the top of the hierarchy. Blackness is positioned at the very bottom. And you are slotted kind of in between based on your ability to approximate whiteness, whether that's physically or in terms of your cultural norms, right? And that's part of what we're trying to disrupt with making sure that people understand these ideas.
Thank you. That's a lot. Let's all take a breath. I forgot at the beginning of this to exactly invite that nuance is our friend and complexity is with us in our life experiences as it is in this discussion. And so I just want to lift up this framing, being invited to think about the construction of whiteness as a violent fiction is also not to imagine that the realities of that construction are not present and powerful and they are actively being experienced by people. So I just want to again shape that nuance is our friend and complexity is here with us. So I think this might be the last question that we can go into before we sort of ask y'all to break up into groups. And this question has to do with talking about the gender nature of anti-Blackness. And I remember this in discussion with you last year around, Black trans women and ideas of Black women as both superhuman and subhuman at the same time, as both super independently strong and also completely lazy and ineffectual. So can you speak to that to help us flesh out and understand more about the dimensions of anti-Blackness?
There's Horton Spillers has an article, you know where I'm going to go there, right? Right. But I'm not going to get too deep into it. It's hard to read. It's dense. But one of the things she argues in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe is just this idea of Black women not being able to be mothers during slavery. The sense that you gave birth, but that child did not belong to you, never belonged to you. Therefore, you didn't have the right to even call yourself mother or to have that position of mother. So that the Black child belonged to the master, right? And in some ways, it could be the child of the master, but the master, of course, never owned that child. So you have this relationship of where one's relationship to one's gender, one just can't embody it for oneself. One's gender does not exist for oneself. It cannot be of one's creation. It's for the youth. And I'm thinking about this because there's a case that you may have seen that this week at, where was this at? I think it was in Texas. The school cop who got off after sexually assaulting a girl, a 14-year-old in the school, and the headline said that he was free after receiving oral sex. I'm like, you can't receive oral sex from a 14-year-old. That's called assault. It's not sex. And you don't. But then I said, well, what is this about? This girl can't be white. This is the inherent Black suspicion, right? This is wait a minute. A school cop got off, and so then somebody did a little research. That school is 85% Black and about 14% Latinx. So that child was probably, in all likelihood, not white, and it was probably a Black child. And the judge let him off. He's not even on the registry. Nothing. So what is that about? What does that kind of say about what they were thinking about this girl who was most likely a Black girl, or somebody that was so proximate to Black in a school that's that high percentage of Black, even those who are not Black get seen as like, well, you're like them, then you have to go to this school. And so somehow this idea that body was not either wanted it was I don't know. So something's going on there in terms of the impossibility of a Black girl to even have possession of her own body, in that it's very specific, and that we do need to think about how anti-Blackness then gets gendered in that context.
What's interesting to me, particularly, I live in Charlotte. I'm active with the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, and we do a lot of advocacy on behalf of Black women and girls. And it's amazing to me how, and having lived a life in a Black girl body, the assumption that I am always without need for protection or support, especially as a woman, a Black woman with a larger body, that I am always the aggressor, that if I end up in some kind of negative situation, surely it's because I ran my mouth, like all these stereotypes, right? All of these, they Sandra Bland. And the Sandra Bland case really had me messed up for a long time because she was driving across country to her new academic job. I've done that literally 5 times. Like, that's me, that's my friends, that's our lives. And this idea that if we choose to assert ourselves, right, if we speak up using our bodies on behalf of ourselves, the response is almost always violence. And in the case of, I think, Black women, girls, femmes, gender non-conforming folks, the kind of abuse and violence that happens at the location of both our racialized and gendered identities is experienced concomitantly, simultaneously, at the same time. And at the same time, perceived as, I don't know, less harsh or valuable, because, you know, I grew up in a time where it was always about endangered Black men, the endangered Black boy, endangered Black males. You know, these schools are so toxic to Black boys. I'm like, well, wait, if I'm in the school too, and the air is toxic, then neither one of us can breathe. Why is it that only he gets the gas mask? Like, why is it that my gendered experience is not being considered in this larger conversation around kind of violent, repressive responses to Black people and Black bodies? I think about the history, the historical narrative that Black women were unrapeable. You know, that's part of the narrative of civil rights that doesn't get talked about, is that part of what spurred on that movement was really the idea that Black women's bodies didn't have autonomy. And I think about, as, you know, someone who had a grandmother who worked scrubbing white folks' floors and in their homes her whole life, I wonder about those women working in those homes and what they might experience at the location of gendered and sexual violence, and we don't have those stories circulating in our public consciousness. So that's all a part of that list.
Yeah, that reminds me, I just want to say this because I've written about it, and I'm surprised that I didn't say this first when you were actually, cue me when you were talking about the gender piece. In writing about the kind of fixation on kind of Black male programs or getting Black males in schools, a lot of that is actually anti-Blackness masked as a kind of benevolence. Like if we can get these boys to become men, they will control their communities, they'll be in charge like they're supposed to, they'll be because what really needs to happen is Black communities need to be disciplined, and we need Black men to do that. And so then there's an only interest in actually nurturing programs. So that in a lot of these statistics you'll see in education, you'll see that Black boys may be here in terms of performance. Black girls may be right here. And then white girls are here and white girls are there. But we're fixated on this percentage of like, well, we need to focus only on Black boys so that Black girls get basically ignored, even though they're only doing a hair better than Black boys on most of these measures. And then up here are where white folks are doing, how they're doing. But so what's that about? And really I think it is about one, shifting the discourse away from actually having to think about anti-Blackness and to think about it as the problem is located in the body. So it's located in the Black girl body and it's located in the Black boy, but for, you know, he's not performing. If we can only discipline them and get them back in charge again of their communities, then we can have order.
Let me say this really quickly. When I engage with white folks, especially white religious progressives and other Unitarian Universalists, and we're talking about kind of inequity and social inequality, I'm at the point now where I often say, look, you have 2 choices. Either you believe that there are institutional, systemic reasons for the dispossession and disenfranchisement of communities of color that undergird all of these disparities that we see kind of touted on the evening news. Or you believe that Black people are inherently crazy, bankrupt, broken, backwards, hate our kids, hate our communities, and hate ourselves. Otherwise, there's no explanation for the mass incarceration, the health disparities. Either you believe one or the other. So when you come to me with this kind of white innocence, I just want to be in solidarity with communities of color and I want to know how to help it. What do you believe about this? Because if you fundamentally believe that Black people are broken, then I'm not trying to talk to you about your solidarity, religious or otherwise. If you understand that this has a history and a lineage and that it's been systemically fortified into institutional structures that separate us all from our humanity and that my liberation is tied up with yours, then maybe we could talk. Yeah. But I need to know where you're at with that. The other thing I want to say is that so much of my experience, I didn't have this language, you know, at 14, 15, right? But so much of my experience as a Black woman has been somewhere between between hypervisibility and misrecognition. Right? I'm hypervisible, especially in UU spaces. Most congregations I've been in, if I'm missing that Sunday, they know. Right? Everybody knows if I'm in the room or not in the room. There's no such thing as anonymity. I lived in Colorado Springs for a little while. If I would go home and visit my mom and come back, the people at the grocery store would say, "You've been away." Y'all see so few black people that if I leave town, you like, you know, I'm just here for toilet paper and ice cream. Like, I'm not trying to do this, right? At the same time, assumptions about my aggression or experience, that misrecognition thing. So it's like everybody can see, but they don't know what they're looking at. And that's kind of a fundamental way I think that anti-blackness plays out. Oh, you can see black people, you can see us. But in terms of what you see, perceive, and discern from our experience, often that is not highly informed and grossly misrepresented.
You know, we didn't say. There's one last thing we did.
Sorry, we're professorial.
Right. No, I realize
good for you.
we didn't get to this point that probably some of you in the audience are already there, but it's important to meditate on what actually understanding what the problem is, what the suffering looks like, what the violence looks like. But there is a conversation about, well, then what should we do, right? Or what's next? What about it? Or the practical thing, whatever. And on some level, there's, I refuse the question and then I'm going to answer the question, right? So refusing this question of kind of that in this society we can somehow gradually move to, you know, greater levels of understanding. In some ways, the theoretical stuff actually suggests, and actually the experience of anti-blackness, if you think about an afterlife of slavery, demands a certain kind of radical shift that is not just a little bit of a transformation. So I spoke earlier about how, in some ways, to the extent that whiteness is a violent fiction, then what does it mean to actually kill whiteness, right? Or what does it mean to kill the master? In other words, if the master-slave relation still exists in the afterlife of slavery, if this is how we know who we are as a nation, or we know who we are racially, what does it mean to actually have a radical refusal of it? What does that look like? And it's going to hurt. And we're in this moment, because, you know, politically, where you do have a kind of white, right, nationalist kind of, where people are feeling defensive, and we see what happens when they feel under threat. They start going out and killing people, running them over in cars, other things. So it's not going to be peaceful. And I think we can maintain some peace in ourselves, but I don't know if this is going to be all very peaceful. In other words, we have to think about a new social order, a new racial order, a new way of even imagining how we do this. And that's going to be painful. But if you have to think about this, think about what emancipation would actually take. In much of this theorizing, there's a suggestion that really what happened in 1863, 1865 was a non-event. The actual relations of slaves continued. Like, what would make you think that all of a sudden you can sign a piece of paper called an Emancipation Proclamation, and the whole idea of the way people know themselves as master and slave would somehow just end? So if it didn't end in 1865, did it end in 1965 or 64 with the signing of the Civil Rights Act? No. So the way we know ourselves, how do we know ourselves differently? And how do we do that structurally, institutionally, but also spiritually, personally? I don't know. But that's the work. The work is a total radical disruption, dismantling of this social order and the creation. Now that's not very practical, but I'm sorry, that's what you got to do.
That's how we get free.
Right. That's what freedom looks like.
So, with that, this is an invitation to, in a few minutes, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to put up questions. We're going to break up into groups, and we're going to try to answer some of those questions. Don't move until I ask you to move, because it'll just be math chaos, right? So I'm going to do that. Then the second thing is the invitation to sit with this idea of anti-blackness as an underlying or foundational idea that undergirds a lot of different things that you may have heard, like structural racism or white supremacy. I just really want people to get clear in their minds that this is an invitation to consider this idea. It comes out of academia, but I think it's very applicable as a separate idea, an underlying idea, and to think about trying to wrap your minds around it in such a way so that we can learn how to dismantle it and disarm it, right? Like, asking folks to grapple with anti-blackness is not just to do it for its own sake. I think that part of Blue's philosophy is really understanding what we are up against so that we might fight it better, right? So, you know, and I also just, because I know there are probably some folks in the room that are like, whoa, did he just really say like kill some white people? He didn't say that. So I just want to like lift that up, right? We're talking about whiteness as a construct, as a violent fiction, right? As a violent fiction. What does it mean to dismantle that? And you can take it to a place of, whoa, what does that mean then for me if you have been positioned as a white person in the world, right? But I just really want to, again, invite us into that place of nuance and complexity and just really highlight that for folks, that we're really talking about dismantling and destroying, you know, anti-Blackness as a construct, right? So just to lift that up. So with that, I'm going to plug in the questions. Did you have something I'm feeling? Did you have anything?
On the one hand, this is from academia, but I'm also thinking about this video that Philando Castile's mother just posted. And really, it's not, it's something that Black people have always known. They're going to keep killing us, right? So on some levels, I want to think about it, there's academic language, but there's also something that people have always known. They are out to get us. They're finding ways designed against our bodies.
Yeah.
So somebody I want to give
faster or slow death.
Yes. So I want to give homage to like the actual people and communities that have already always constructed this theory outside of academia entirely. This is something Black people know.
Yeah. Yep. Right. Right, and we know it even here today, because the first thing someone said to me after my plenary address was, "You really look like Michelle," and I said, "Michelle who?" And she said, "Michelle Obama." And I just walked away. So with that, I'm not kidding you, for real. We're going to ask folks to actually break up into identity affinity groups. So that means like Black folks with Black folks, non-Black POC folks with non-Black POC folks, and white folks with white folks. Now, there's a very specific reason we're asking you to do it that way, and that's because this is painful for Black folks to explore. Also, there is something that happens that I have yet to be in a room mixed racially where under the white gaze, white people don't feel entitled to the knowledge, insight, and experiences of Black folks. And so we want to disrupt that sense of entitlement first and foremost, and we also want to protect our hearts and spirits as Black folks exploring this difficult topic. We also want to invite white folks to sit with this, to try to work through it and be in discomfort and learn how to be with each other. I think there's a practice in this work to rely really heavily on the emotional labor of Black folks. So we want to encourage you to take on that emotional labor for yourselves. So with that, I think the group size, what did we say? Professors? 5. Okay, so in groups of 5, again, with folks who are, you know, of identity, and don't be afraid to ask folks, like, hey, how do you identify if there's a question? We don't want to make assumptions. Go ahead and take 2 minutes to do that. We will come around with paper, and then these are the questions we're going to ask you to answer. And it's going to be quick. We're only going to have, I'll wait till y'all are in your groups to go first. what is the action people are called to do, and what is the difference between direct action and public witness. I'll read those one more time. What are you called to do in light of the reality that is anti-Blackness? What is this, that's like a follow-up, what is this action that people are called to do? And what is the difference between direct action and public witness?
Thank you.
So those are just some suggested questions. If you want to go deeper on other ones, do it, but these are what we're asking. And you have about 10 minutes. So at 4:18, we'll reconvene. Ready? But since we're short on time, we'll just ask you to continue writing up your ideas, and then folks can take a look at them as they leave. This conversation doesn't have to end here, right? There are resources on the Black Lives of UU website, actually. A lot of reading. I know UUs love reading, myself included. And we have those actually. The trick is that they are actually from GA of last year. We posted them all. So if you go on our website, you can do a search for GA 2016, or you can scroll down to the bottom. And there's actually a lot of really good reading to help go further into this, deeper into this idea specifically of anti-Blackness and how it is operationalized in our world. So thank you for that. And I think we are just actually going to close out because I'm just looking at the time. It is 4:24 and we want to be out of here at 4:30. Do continue writing up your ideas. We also will take a picture of these and we can put them up on our website as well so people can see and share. So I'll invite our guests to give us some concluding thoughts, and then Kenny will close us out.
Okay. I think it's easy sometimes when we talk about these issues to dismiss, we think about whiteness as a social construct or race as a social construct. I think that line is often invoked as a kind of dismissal of the importance of those ideologies and how they control people's life chances. I mean, money is also a social construct, but that doesn't keep us from wanting it or spending it. So let's be clear about how we also, particularly those of us who identify as white, use that whiteness as a particular kind of currency in a system that rewards people for embodying and enacting anti-Blackness. So that's really something that I want to offer into this space. And also, I think it's really important for all of us to maybe consider where comfort and security is in our hierarchy of needs. Again, particularly for folks who identify as white, because so often white comfort and white security is found at the expense of non-Black people of color and Black folks in particular.